Hi, I'm Bruce Eckel,
I'm James Ward.
and in this section of First Steps in Flex, we're going to look at item renderers. And I have to say, even though we've been putting these components in and they've been doing all these magical things for us automatically, I have to admit I'm feeling a little helpless because it seems like it's made all of these decisions for me already.
Yeah.
Do we have choices here, or are we stuck with what we're given?
You definitely have choices. In list-based controls, which we've seen a number of already, they render data in a way that is kind of the expected default way to render a data. So a
And
string,
most of the time, that's pretty cool. You
Yeah.
know, it's usually what you want. So
Yeah.
I'm impressed by that. But
yeah, I mean, one line of code to get a data grid that renders a bunch of data is pretty cool. But let's say you want some special things. You want your data rendered in a different way. And so that's what we're going to look at, is how we actually customize, especially these list-based controls. So to kind of give an idea of what list-based controls do, there's two primary things that list controls do. They allow you to select something in a list. And by list-based control, I mean data grid, list, and there's a number of others as well.
And just to make sure everybody's clear, we're talking about list-based controls in this example, but in general, anything that gets rendered can be adapted to our needs this way. Okay.
Definitely. And so with the list-based controls, there is a default way that it renders each item in the underlying data set. And so, for instance, in a list, a string is rendered as a string. And so with what we have in Flex is the ability to override that behavior. And so that's what we're going to take a look at, is how do we create a custom way to override the rendering. And so the list-based controls do two primary things. They do selection and they do virtualization. And what virtualization in a list is it says, if I have a list and there's a million items in the underlying data, but on the screen there's visually only 10 items. What it will say is that I need to create 10 renderers to render that data, and then as the user scrolls through those items or does filters, it's going to reuse those 10 items and then just push it different data. And so in order to get those 10 things on the screen, we use item render. So it's actually creating instances of some other component, 10 instances of some other component, and then putting those into the list control. And so what an item renderer does is it allows us to override the default rendering that is being used when it instantiates that. So let's go take a look at how to actually do this. We'll call this one item renderers. So in our item renders, let's remove our layout absolute. And what we're first going to do is we need some data to actually use in our list-based control. So what we're going to do is create an array collection, set the ID to colors, and now inside of our array collection, let's give it some objects. So first object, its name is red, and the color property is going to be 0x. We're doing the hex here for red, which is FF0000. And then let's copy and paste this, and we'll add a few other colors here. So green, and green is going to be 00FF00, and blue, which is 0000FF. It's just the hex notation for colors. Okay, so now let's add our list-based controls. So let's first, not that, let's add in a list and set the data provider. We're going to use data binding to bind to our colors array collection.
And now what if you just displayed it that way?
If we just display it that way, if I get my syntax correct, then what we will see is a list that is just saying object, object, object. So what's happening is it's using the default item render, which is just essentially doing toString on that object and then displaying that in the list. So that's what we want to override. We don't want this list to say object, object, object. We want it to say the color, and we want it to actually be the color that is specified there in this color value. So that would take a custom item renderer to do that. We could change the label property, as we saw in the last chapter, for what the list would use to set the label, But in this case, we want to set the color too, and there's not any way on a list control to set the color of the text per each item. You can set it for every item, but not per each item. So this is a classic example where we need a custom item render. So in order to have a custom item render, what we need is a class. We have to give this thing the class that we want to use for each visible item in the list. And so in this case, we could create, if we look back to a few chapters ago where we showed all the different ways to create custom components, we're going to, in this case, use the mx::component tag to create our custom item render. So let's add our, before we do that, we need to tell it what property we're setting here on the list, which is the item renderer property. So what we're doing is overriding the default item renderer with our own item renderer. And now this is where we give it the component.
And again, all this stuff could be done with ActionScript as well.
Exactly. Okay, so now the component that we want to use is a label. So what we're doing is our new component, which we didn't specify the class name like we'd done before. So it's actually going to pick a class name for us, just some essentially random name, and we don't have to be concerned with the class name here. But that class will extend the label, and then we're going to set the text. So our text property on our label, what we're going to use is data binding. What we're going to bind to is data. So every custom component that we create that implements this item renderer interface has this data property. And what we can then do is access the name. So what's happening is that every time we create an instance of this component and use it as an item render, it's going to set the data property on that equal to whatever
the current object of interest is. Okay.
And so if you then scroll through a list, all that it's going to do is it's going to set that data property again. So that's why the lists use virtualization, is that it doesn't have to constantly be recreating these visual representations of these components. It creates them once at the beginning of application startup in this case. And in this case, it's going to create how many ever we need for the visible area that the list is taking up, and then it's just going to set the data property, and that will trigger the data mining, which will display the text.
And so if we were to run it right now, it would just show us the names of the colors.
Yep, exactly. There we go.
Bingo.
Red, green,
okay,
and
but
blue.
They're not
they're
color
not
yet.
colored. And that's very similar to the out-of-the-box item renderer in Flex, the list item renderer. So now let's go set the color property as well. So now what we're going to actually do is say color equals, and we're going to use data binding and bind it to the color property of the item that we're rendering. And so now this is something where we need a custom item render, and there we go. We see our list is now rendering those labels, but setting the color based on some property. If you wanted to put images in a custom item render, or that's
so in other words, it doesn't have to be a label. It can be any object that presumably has some sort of visual rendering.
Absolutely.
And so every time the list is when it's going through and trying to render everything, it says, okay, I have this object. What do I have to render it with? And it goes and looks at that, and it sticks everything in just by looking at data.
Right.
Data
exactly.
dot this, data dot that. Okay.
Yep. So, another frequent usage here is where, let's say I want to have like a checkbox inside of my list. So what I've done is I've made my item render an HBox, which is just a general horizontal container. I've added a checkbox, and I've added my label. And now, when we refresh this, we should see, there we go, we get checkboxes now inside of our list.
Excellent.
Yep. And if we wanted to hook this up and make it, actually manipulate, so when they click the checkbox, we want it to manipulate the underlying data, we'd have to do a little bit more work.
But we'd probably, at that point, want to drop into ActionScript, right?
We could. Yep. Yeah. Our custom item renderer can be written in ActionScript or MXML, whichever one you prefer.
Okay, well, I don't feel helpless anymore.
Good.